Hi, welcome to week 2, and this week we are going to discuss evidence and its use in the policy process. More specifically, we're going to cover some of the themes from chapters 1 through 4 of the book we're currently working on, which is Calling Bullshit. To say it again, I will not be summarizing the book. These are, adding to those themes and sort of providing a bit of commentary on them. So one of the things to first understand is, where we have bullshit, which is essentially everywhere, and then why there's so much of it, and even before that, what exactly we mean when we say bullshit. So the salient feature, there's a book by the philosopher Harry Frankfurt, it's just called On Bullshit, which holds that the defining feature is that bullshit is truth agnostic, which is to say it's different from lying in the sense of the bullshitter just doesn't care about the truth. True and false are not the relevant categories. What's being said serves some other purpose. So we talk and communicate for all sorts of reasons. Social reasons, like small talk about the weather to help people get comfortable with each other. Informative reasons, like when we're passing information back and forth, and this is a lot of what academics think about. But there's also, social dominance reasons, when the point of your speech is just to assert a certain position within society, or to assert belonging to a certain group of people who also share that belief and that manner of speaking, right? So, bullshit to some extent, again, differentiated from lying, is not that it's false, although it often is, it's that it just doesn't care what the truth is. It's serving some other sort of function there. An additional issue we have could be referred to as the asymmetry of bullshit, which is it takes a lot more work to refute it than it does to produce it. And this is also known as Brandolini's principle. Okay, so in chapter 2, once we get past the first chapter and talking about what bullshit is and why we should care about it, we talk a bit about social media and why BS can spread on social media. And I will note that this isn't entirely new. In the past it could spread through tabloids, email chains, etc. But social media certainly scales that effect up, right, and makes it much more visible. And one of the problems here is an incentive structure. To the extent that you get engagement off of this content, then social media companies have a financial incentive to allow that. But even when social media companies want to stop misinformation because, either they think that's what they should do, or it's part of a longer term business strategy where they think, sure, it's immediate engagement, but long term it's bad for the reputation of the company, right? This is actually quite a difficult problem. So first you have to define misinformation. So there's stuff that's obviously false, but then there's also stuff that's just lacking context. And at some point there's the line between stuff that's wildly misleading and lacks context versus an opinion that, by nature identifies facts that support it and often leaves out facts that don't support it because we are constrained in terms of how much space we have to get stuff across. So there's a line between what's just wildly misleading and clearly not, a good faith effort to engage with all of the relevant info versus what's just presenting an opinion within a given amount of space and can't possibly address, all relevant information. But even if we could define misinformation, you have to identify these posts and do it, before it spreads widely, and do it in some sort of way that is, roughly neutral with regards to the mix of people's political, religious, and racial identities all across your platform, right? And then finally, you have to be so good at identifying it that you're not taking down a large number of false positives, which is also actually quite difficult. If you take down anything that might be misinformation, then you're going to take down a bunch of stuff that isn't. But if you only take down stuff that you're, 99 or 100% sure is misinformation, you're going to miss a lot of it. I don't know that even if you're only taking down when you're 99% sure, there are millions upon millions of posts going up across, all of our social media platforms. Even if 1 in 100 is wrongfully taken down, that's a lot. That's arguably too high of a rate in terms of how much gets taken down. Depending, maybe on how serious misinfo or, in this case, other platforms are. I'm not claiming we should hold a 99% bar for any sort of content removal across social media, but I'm just noting that because it scales, you're always going to see these examples of, false positives, essentially, where someone somewhere has their content mistaken for something that is misinformation or otherwise violating, perhaps in a more serious way, and thus is taken down. Okay, so the other thing that this covers, the book covers, although it's now old enough that it was before ChatGPT, even though it's a recent book, generative AI is even more recent and has exploded across the scene. Although maybe the hype cycle has died down a little bit relative to like 1 or 2 months ago. But the big thing, and one of the immediate concerns here, is quite literally that generative AI reduces the cost of bullshitting. Like, it's now quite easy to put in a short prompt, get something long and reasonable sounding and well written in the sense of being grammatically correct and not having, spelling errors and so forth, and not like easy to obviously identify. And the other thing is the cost is going down, but the cost of refuting is actually going up. And this is because we have a bit of a breakdown of social trust. So it's not realistic to expect people to investigate absolutely everything they hear. So we need sort of these widely trusted information filters like academic institutions, scientific establishments, and news media. The problem is, like, we don't actually socially have a group of trusted information filters. And this is something we'll return to when we talk about polarization later on in this class. But without any sort of like shared understanding of how we establish what is actually factual information, other than like look into everything yourself, which is, more time consuming than is realistic, we wind up in a world where we don't even agree on, the basic facts or realities of the things we're talking about. Okay, want to move on, talking about black box algorithms. Some of the initial ones. So one we're going to talk about in depth later in this course is in Allegheny County, which is the county in Pennsylvania that Pittsburgh is in. An algorithm to detect child abuse and neglect is being deployed by Child Youth Services. In actuality, it's trained on whether or not additional calls are made to youth services, not whether or not the child is abused or neglected, which causes some problems in terms of like our outcome proxy is not actually the outcome we want. But again, we're going to go into depth on that later. One of the first places to really draw attention to this, though, is in making parole decisions. There's an algorithm called COMPAS that is now quite widely used to predict the odds of recidivism. And this is used as an input into parole decision. It is a racially biased algorithm, which causes a problem. I've linked to the original ProPublica article from a few years back that first really highlighted this issue, but it's since been raised several times. There's also the issue of like when we build these things, particularly in a black box way, we get perhaps unexpected outcomes. So this is the smile detector. There was a machine learning model that was supposed to detect criminality from photos, which is a bit dystopian to start with. The idea that we're going to show someone a photo and then know whether or not they're a criminal. Definitely not, a great reality to live in from any sort of like privacy or due process standards. But the other thing is, in reality, this machine was literally a smile detector because it was trained on mugshots and then non-mugshots, and people don't usually smile in their mugshots. So like this criminality detector literally just detected whether or not you were smiling. There are some other examples, like something that was supposed to detect cancerous moles actually detected the presence of a ruler, because the pictures with a ruler were more likely to be ones that someone was measuring for, medical purposes, right? So again, like you can pick up on these sort of background changes. I think one that was supposed to tell wolves from dogs actually just detected whether or not there was snow in the background, right? So again, if you're not really careful about this, and if you don't understand what's going on in the algorithm and what your model is actually picking up on, there's all sorts of ways to make mistakes, and in many cases these could have extremely serious consequences. Like, fortunately, this criminality model was never deployed, unlike the ones we were talking about before with, COMPAS and parole decisions. Really is quite widely deployed and has its own series of problems. And then we talked about this already, but generative AI is likely to make this problem worse. Okay, so I do want to spend a bit more time on understanding causation. So it's fairly famous to say correlation is not causation, and this is true, but I think it's a bit incomplete. So causation is not something that can be directly observed, and I'll go back to David Hume, Scottish philosopher, on this. He argues that we directly observe like some sort of chain of events and our mind puts them together, but causation is a work that we are doing mentally, a framework we use to make sense of the world rather than like a raw property of the world. And this seems to correspond a lot with what we see in physics, where most equations that explain things can work in essentially either direction, right? Like we are the ones putting this sort of time-bound causal inference of like A happens and this causes B to happen, as opposed to like A happens at one time, B happens at another time, and you could, you just observe that these two things are together. So this means for us more practically, we'll get away from the abstract, that causation is always grounded in some sort of theoretical model. Like we are providing this sort of mental background of we observe these things together, thus we think they're causal. And you should think of evidence for causation as running from strong evidence to very weak evidence. So like we're probably familiar with spurious correlations, and observational correlations are very weak evidence. If there's some surprising correlation, you certainly don't want to accept it. On the other hand, frequently things that correlate are causal. Like this also happens. If you observe that, when prices fall, people sell more of a good, that's a simple correlation, and it's also almost certainly causal based on, a lot of additional economic research that goes well beyond correlations. But it's not that surprising that, some percentage of correlations, especially those that, make theoretical sense to be causally related, are going to turn out to actually be causally related. It's weak evidence. I wouldn't, recommend it overturning anything, but it is, evidence. Well-designed experiments, on the other hand, are really strong evidence. And I want to say that theoretically, the strongest possible evidence we could get would be going back in time and changing just one thing, seeing how the results change. Or, some sort of multiverse where we think there's branching realities and we go to a nearby branch where there's just one difference and we see how the results are different as a result. And the reason I say this is, we can't do those things. We can't time travel or explore multiverses or any of that. But I think it's worth understanding that what we are trying to do with all of our experiments and all of our stats and econometrics is come as close as possible to that ideal of isolating a single change. So like when we run an experiment, we can't go back in time, but we can keep everything possible as similarly as we can. Now, there's also, issues where we cannot run experiments, right? And so we are limited to observational studies. And a lot of those show up in social science. It's either impractical or wildly unethical to run experiments on some of the things we would care about here. And that leaves us with, fancy statistics and econometrics, which can be fun, but depending on how well they're done, could be weak evidence, could be strong evidence, and are generally not going to be as strong as if we could really isolate just one thing in an experimental fashion. So common pitfalls, selection bias, which we're going to talk about a little more at the end, and then spurious correlations, and I've just linked here in the slides to a spurious correlations website that is fun to play around with and see some examples of spurious correlations. Just pausing here so people can read this, and of course it's linked in the slides if you want to look. So statistical modeling can help, but as I said above, it's not a sure fix. There's an approach in some circles which is more or less the kitchen sink approach to regression, which is like throw as many variables in as possible. But this can also wind up, being misleading, as you can control for things that should not be controlled for within the regression. I've got some examples here. We're not going to go too in depth into causation, but as a general principle, what you should do is generally draw out the causal path, the theoretical model that we talked about, before you start doing the math, so that you understand and you have some sort of theoretical reason for thinking that what you're seeing might actually be causal. Okay, finally, we've got some discussion questions that I'm going to post in Slack, and I'm looking forward to a good discussion this week.